Now, therefore, while the youthful hue sits on thy skin like morning dew, and while thy willing soul transpires at every pore with instant fires, now let us sport us while we may. And now, like amorous birds of prey, rather at once our time devour, than languish in his slow-chapped power. Let us roll all our strength and all our sweetness up into one ball, and tear our pleasures with rough strife through the iron gates of life. Thus, though we cannot make our sun stand still, yet we will make him run.
Ho-ri-o-ho, ho-ri-o-ho, ho-ri-o-ho-ho.
Hello and welcome once again to the Spouter-Inn. I'm Chris.
And I'm Suzanne.
And this time we're doing something a little bit different. We're reading a selection of metaphysical poems.
Yeah, this is a bit different because while we've done poetry before, it's always been as some sort of larger whole, either a long narrative poem like, Paradise Lost or the Mahabharata, or a collection that understood itself as one thing like Whitman's Leaves of Grass. This is quite different from that.
Yeah, we're not even just doing one author this time. We're looking at two.
Yeah, which is, I think it's kind of good because I think each one of them brings out something about the other, like that. I mean, not dialogue exactly, but I think you see things by looking at one against the other.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm looking forward to seeing how that plays out. And I think it also just gave us more opportunities to talk about a cluster of ideas that were emerging in a particular time and place. In this case, England in the early 1600s.
Yeah. And the other thing that kind of strikes me about these, and as I was reading the poems for today, is that it lets us talk about, I don't know if you want to say form or like, not so much the content. Like we always talk about the content of the works we're reading. And this gives us an opportunity to talk about the shape, and not just the shape, but kind of how they work. I keep thinking about these as like little machines of form, right? That are like preoccupied with, how long they are, how symmetrical they are, what the lines are doing, how the pieces relate to the whole. So I feel like we'll get a chance to talk about that in a way I don't think we have before.
Yeah, well, I mean, we're only looking at a dozen poems that are a page or two each, as opposed to the entirety of the Mahabharata and its 100,000 lines or whatever it was. So yeah, we definitely can zoom in quite a lot more. And of course, lyric poems, short poems like these are designed for that in a sense. You're meant to measure everything with a lot more weight and let everything sink in. And so it should merit a bit more attention to each of the fine details.
Yeah. And I think it will allow us an opportunity to read out, we always read out some lines here and there, right? But to read out some lines and even like a few passages, because so much, I don't know, for me anyway, so much of what I get out of this material is like the musicality of it almost, or like the rhythm of it, or like how it makes you feel like body wise. And that strikes me as such a different experience from reading long works.
Yeah, usually. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting when long works can do it, but of course it's harder to keep up that level of intensity over an entire book.
Yeah, that's true too. So should we say a little bit about metaphysical poets and what that might be?
Yeah. I don't know that much about them. I mean, I've read a little bit of Marvell and I've read a bit more of Donne back when I was starting to read more poetry, but I don't really have a sense of metaphysical poets as a school or anything. What exactly is the deal?
Well, I am not an expert, right? But I do have a sense of like this mode of writing, and also a sense of it as a kind of a school, as you said. The thing is, the important, I think, to take away is that it's not actually a school as such. It's not really a community of writers in any tightly knit kind of way, though there are some coteries that share poems and people will sometimes write poems to one another. It's more of a retrospective kind of projection onto the early 17th century past that comes out of later literary history, especially in the 19th century. Romantics really were interested in sort of defining themselves against metaphysical writing. And then in the early 20th century, there's a popularizing of some of the metaphysical writers, especially done by people like T.S. Eliot and then also some literary critics. So it's kind of a retrospective projection, a kind of imagined community that gets projected onto the past. And the reason I have some sense of this actually is because when I was in grad school, I almost did 17th century as like my main thing instead of medieval. So it was like a minor field. So I it's not that I know a lot about it, but at one time I had read a lot of stuff. And then occasionally I would teach them. And I really, really like the literature. Like I like the way it makes me feel. And I almost wonder sometimes if one of the reasons I didn't do that as a main specialization was because it was too much emotional and not enough kind of intellectual. Like with the Middle Ages, I'm like, oh, this is a super interesting period, but I didn't have that many feelings about it. But this stuff I had a lot of feelings about. And so it seemed like it would be very hard to write about.
Interesting.
Wasn't that weird?
So why did they get called metaphysical?
Well, this is a term that shows up. Samuel Johnson refers to the metaphysical poets. He does this in the late 18th century. And it's often thought to be the case that he's responding to something that a late 17th century writer, John Dryden, had said, talking about Donne's metaphysics in his poetry, that his amorous verses had metaphysics where nature only should reign. And so by metaphysics they're talking about basically philosophy and philosophical concepts, and even modes of logical argumentation, which we might talk about later, are showing up in, love lyric. And Dryden was like, what is this? And Johnson, kind of groups them together as a bunch of writers, as metaphysical poets, as a school of people that do that. And like, as I was suggesting, this kind of gets codified into an idea of a kind of a movement in literature. And so it's basically two things. It's philosophy showing up in literature, showing up in lyric love poetry in particular. And it also refers to like the mechanism for that. And again, this is something we'll talk about probably, especially when we're looking at Donne. This idea of the metaphysical conceit. And again, this is a modern term. This is a term that gets invented by, like later critics. And it's a way to talk about a weird kind of metaphor that shows up in these poems. So for example, just to name a really famous one, in Donne's Valediction Forbidding Morning, which is one of the poems we'll look at, there's this very famous kind of metaphor of compasses, that have 2 feet. One stays fixed and the other one, you can draw a circle with the other foot, right? And this is an extended metaphor that is carrying a lot of weight. And sometimes the language that gets used to talk about it is that of vehicle and tenor. So vehicle being the compasses in this example, and tenor being the relationship of the two people, the two that are one, the relationship of lover and beloved, the reciprocity, the idea of the circle is a perfect form. See, it's not like a regular metaphor where you have like love is a rose, where you have like, a thing, a rose, and then love, what it represents. It's instead like this really open-ended kind of metaphoricality. Anyway, so that's what they mean by talking about metaphysical conceit. It's like a metaphor that just keeps on giving.
Right. Conceit is, etymologically the same word as concept. And if you think about like a high concept sci-fi film or something, it's where there's one giant idea behind it all. You think of Inception or Arrival or whatever, and then you're just exploring what happens when you play with this idea. And it's meant to be a big idea, like a rose being for love isn't a big idea. It's an obvious idea that we've talked about a million times.
Oh my God.
But a compass that you draw circles with as being two lovers, that's a lot. That's not something that's weird. And so we think of it as a conceit, a high concept poem idea. And that's, I think, what a lot of the pull for these poems comes from, is this, are you into this sort of this mind-blowing moment of these elaborate metaphors? Like, are you going, yeah, what the heck is that about? Oh, neat. Or are you going, that's ridiculous? And it seems like some critics, including maybe Johnson, were like, this is a little too much. These are silly.
Yeah. No, that it's perplexing. That's one of the things that Johnson says, right? And it depends on if you enjoy the perplexingness or the weirdness of it or the strangeness, or whether you're repelled by it or whether you're attracted by it. One of the most beautiful, I think, and weird examples of this is one slightly later metaphysical poet, Lovelace, who has this one poem that is called The Grasshopper. And it's talking about like grasshoppers, hanging out and enjoying the hot weather. And then, it gets cold, right? It's the usual kind of fable, right? And he calls him a green fool and now green ice, and just that half line, and now green ice, you're like, what?
What does that mean?
And then you take it all apart and you could take it apart for half an hour. It's the weirdest metaphor, right? So it's that kind of strangeness, right? Very vivid strangeness that I think is probably key to metaphysical poetry. And then we chose it for this cluster and chose some of these poems in particular because there's a lot of talking about sex in them. And it's interesting to think about what it's doing there, especially in the light of this like philosophical content we were talking about in metaphysical poetry. Like, what is going on there? What is sex for in these poems? Because it's all over the place in a lot of them.
Or what is philosophy for? In some cases, it seems like the philosophy is there in order to get to the sex.
Mm-hmm. Sometimes that's real clear.
It's a logical argument why we should bang.
Yeah. No, and some of these poems, like His Coy Mistress is doing that. The Flea is doing that. Mm-hmm. They're like, let me explain to you logically why we should have sex right now. Some find it charming. Right?
It'll be an interesting thought to decide whether these could have ever worked or not. So we're looking at two poets, Andrew Marvell and John Donne in particular. Now, you mentioned that this is sort of a later school, this idea of the metaphysical poets. Did these two poets actually interact with each other or know each other?
No, they're generationally pretty far apart. Donne is a little bit earlier. His dates are 1572 to 1631. Marvell 1621 to 78. So Marvell's like 10 years old when Donne died. So they're not of the same generation at all. Marvell's actually of more of Milton's generation, his junior, but that's the world he circulates in. Whereas Donne is, part of another kind of community. But they have something in common in the sense of the kind of the readership that they have. In Donne's own lifetime, some of his poems circulated in sort of, in coterie environments, like sort of privately circulated manuscript bundles, right? Sort of a in crowd. And something of the same probably happened with Marvell's works, though we have less evidence for that than we have for Donne. So that's their common ground. Like they probably shared readers, but they themselves were not in the same orbit. And it's interesting to think about if Marvell would have known Donne's poetry or not. That's unclear. So I'm going to start with Marvell, even though he's a bit later, just because I think he's in some ways more accessible and easier to talk about, even while he's also private and kind of bizarre. He's more than anything else a politician. He sat in the House of Commons off and on for a long period of time, and he also served as the Latin secretary under Cromwell's government during that period of time between Charles I and Charles II, when there is no royal government in England. And Latin secretary may sound like a trivial role, but it's actually really important in terms of diplomatic communications and so on. Milton helped him get the job. Milton was the person who was the Latin secretary before him. And when Milton started to lose his sight, he recommended Marvell for the job. And Marvell later on returned the favor because once Charles II was back on the throne, Milton was, most of his peers were executed or imprisoned for a long time. And Marvell is said to have helped him get off. And the reason he could do this is Marvell was a supreme operator. Yeah, like it was some of his earliest poems. One of his earliest poems when he wrote when he was still in college was celebrating Charles I and his queen's birth of one of their children. So he's like, sucking the royalist toes. But then as soon as Charles I is executed, he's like, whoa, revolution looks great. I'm in. And so he was involved in the revolutionary government of Cromwell. But then when the restoration happened under Charles II in 1660, he's in there too. So he's somebody who really, really understood how to navigate the political winds. And a private person. Very little of his poetry circulated in his own lifetime. Not married, though there was somebody who claimed to have been married to him after his death, but who knows, right? So a strange, interesting, weird guy, but an awesome poet. Now, Donne, on the other hand, it's like we know, a reasonable amount about his private life, mostly what he cares to tell us, which he does in a lot of different places, prose as well as poetry. Though he tended, like I said, his poems mostly circulated in this coterie kind of environment. He did publish some. He published these two long, very beautiful poems called the Anniversary Poems in 1612, the first anniversary and the second anniversary. And maybe someday we might talk about them because they're super interesting. But most of his life was spent as a clergyman. And in fact, he was the dean of St. Paul's Cathedral during the last 10 years of his life. This, though, came as the result of a religious conversion. And it's hard to know exactly what his experience was. His family was recusant Catholic, which means they were Catholic at a time when it was extremely dangerous to be Catholic. And that danger became greater and greater, so much so that Donne's brother died in prison after those laws were tightened up in 1593. So his brother dies in prison. Donne apparently converts not too long after that. And it's hard to know exactly, was this political expediency? Was this heartfelt? Presumably by the time he becomes a clergyman in the Church of England, it's heartfelt. But, there's a lot of theological language that's often also erotic, right? That shows up in his work. And thinking about that part of his life is kind of, gives you insight into the poetry, and the poetry gives you insight into the life. The other kind of interesting thing in his biography is that early on, it looked like he was set for a wonderful diplomatic kind of career. He was very successful. He'd converted to Anglicanism so he could hold important kinds of positions. He was chief secretary to the Lord Keeper of the Great Seal, Sir Thomas Egerton, and that's like quite a posh young man's job. But then he ran away with Egerton's niece. And got married to her, Anne Moore, and got in huge amounts of trouble, and they had to live in exile and poverty for a long time. And she had 12 children in 16 years and then died in childbirth, predictably, right? And this is often read as evidence of their incredible love for one another. I'm like, sure. Maybe. Anyway, so she dies in 1617, and then he becomes Dean of St. Paul's not long after that, and that's where he finishes up his life. So he wrote a lot of stuff, really interesting prose works as well as the poems, including those we'll take a look at today. So that's the sort of the story of these two men, very different lives, right? And you could see how each of the lives kind of lends itself to narrativization, like a story, because there's so much emotion and so much life and so much suggested in the poems that you almost automatically flesh out lives, imagine lives for them, which I find kind of interesting.
Yeah. No, they definitely seem like they have very interesting lives. And it's interesting that neither of them published much. Was poetry of this kind of lyric poetry, was it generally more of a coterie? You hand it out to your friends and intimates rather than trying to get it published kind of deal?
Yeah. Well, it depends what you're doing, right? So both of them, the stuff that appears in their lifetime is the stuff that's important for patronage. And, if I didn't underline that enough, that's something that really unites these two figures. Marvell in his early life, was mostly a tutor. He was a tutor to, I think, the ward of Lord Fairfax, who was a really important military leader in the revolutionary government. He was also a tutor to a ward of Cromwell's, right? So, and you might be like, oh, tutor, he's just teaching kids. These are patronage roles that are really about the men whose children he's educating as opposed to the children. You know what I mean? So that patronage relationship is super important for him. Same thing for Donne. He's in this patronage kind of relationship with Egerton that falls apart. And then later on, he's seeking out relationships that can further. So the things they publish are poems that are, celebrating their patron or a friend of their patron or something like that. Donne's anniversary poems, for example, have that kind of presentation context, right? So that's the stuff you publish, because it's a public act. It's meant to be a gift of some kind, and it will encourage a reciprocal gift, right? But the coteries that the love poetry, it's meant to be for an insider crowd. I think that's the sense I have, that it's meant to be for people who are kind of in the know, who get it, who will laugh at the jokes in the right places and stuff. You know what I mean? So it's this inside outside kind of world.
Interesting. Well, good. I think we're focusing mostly on the private stuff today, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
Another time we could think about the public. Yeah, no. And with Marvell, it's really interesting because stuff survives in manuscript, like it was in his papers, right? So there's not even that much evidence of coterie circulation. So you got to wonder, what is this stuff for? And his public persona and the guy who writes these poems, just it's kind of remarkable and weird. So we should look at some of the poems that you said that had you read a lot of this stuff earlier or not so much?
I mean, I had certainly read the greatest hits, although I guess not even all the greatest hits of Marvell, because I think most of the poems that we picked out are reasonably well known. And I feel like I only knew To His Coy Mistress.
That's the real famous one.
That's very famous.
Yeah.
Maybe I had seen one or two of the others, but they didn't leave much of an impression. And I'd read a lot of Donne. At some point, I picked up a complete Donne and read any poem that wasn't too long or too Jesus-y looking. So I think I've read most, if not all of these before, but it's been a while since I've thought about them very much.
Do you have a preference for one or the other? I like them both, but I definitely have preferences. How did it strike you?
I strongly prefer Donne to Marvell. Partially because, and I think we'll talk about this in a bit, but partially because he's really baffling in an interesting way. I find myself, when I'm reading him, constantly unsure of what's going on in a good and productive way. It's like listening to really just at the edge of your understanding music, let's say, right? He's like a prog rock musician or something, where you're just trying to keep up with this prog rock or avant jazz kind of stuff. And you're like, this is great. And it's intense. And I don't quite understand what's going on. And I like it.
No, that totally makes sense. That's a really good metaphor. Now, yeah, I mean, I like them both. Marvell, I have a lot of passion for, and I think it's because it's so tightly controlled, almost mathematical in some ways. You start thinking about what are the parts, what are the whole, how do they relate? I was, because you prepared a PDF, of the poems we were going to talk about, so we could share that with listeners really easily. And I was writing on it, and I'm writing weird little mathy things on here, dividing up, lines and stanzas and so on, and even understand. I literally at one point wrote it out. It's more or less an algebraic equation, how the lines break up and Mower gets around. And the reason it's so interesting is, of course, when he violates the structure. I mean, that's what's interesting, is he creates these very elaborate structures and then busts them. And if you notice the places where they break, it's purposeful. And I kind of like that control and then, purposeful lack of control.
Sure. I find Marvell's ear to be a bit more familiar, let's say, or he's playing in a much more traditional set of sounds, and in particular rhymes. He's really into rhymed couplets, although that's not everything he does, but it's often, A, B, B, C, C kind of rhyme scheme, and very often not especially interesting rhymes. So the mower against the gardens, luxurious man to bring his vice in use, did after him the world seduce, and from the fields the flowers and plants allure, where nature was most plain and pure. Like, that's a standard iambic rhythm, which is fine. They're all doing iambic rhythms of some form or another, and those are really bog standard, not terribly exciting end rhymes. And that's what he does for the most part. And maybe he switches it up occasionally. And certainly there are some that are more interestingly structured than that. But that's sort of his default, his baseline of like, that's the field of poetry that he's playing off of. Whereas Donne sort of takes that whole thing and throws it away.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. So you'll see Marvell, for example, go really in a sort of weird direction with the rhyme schemes in something like On a Drop of Dew, which we might talk about later. But as you say, the rhyme couplets are the standard MO. And they don't get too sing-songy, like he's got a real control of that, usually tetrameter line, with the 4 beats in it. And then, like I said, the deviation. So just to stick with the mower against gardens for a second, he first enclosed within the garden square a dead and standing pool of air, and a more luscious earth for them did need, which stupefied them while it fed. The pink that grew then as double as his mind. So that line, that half line, and a more luscious earth for them did need, like, and a more luscious, like there's this weird thing going on there with this sort of proliferation of extra syllables around the idea of lusciousness and the luscious earth and this sensuous nature, right, that we were kind of bringing out a little bit and talking about Marvell. This is something he comes back to over and over again. So this poem, The Mower Against Gardens, and this, and I mention it because it touches on this part-whole kind of relationship that I alluded to before. It's one poem. It stands by itself, The Mower Against Gardens. But it's also part of a group of 4 poems that are often called the Mower poems. So The Mower Against Gardens, Damon the Mower to the Glowworms, and The Mower's Song. And they're conventionally put together because they're kind of all dealing with the same world, this green world where the mower works. So a mower is like a guy who's like got a scythe and he sort of mows the grass in a field, right? So he sort of keeps nature from overgrowing, from becoming too much, to keep us from drowning in the green world, right? So it's a weird figure. It's an interesting figure because on one hand, it's really sort of idyllic and, nature oriented, and it harks back to sort of ancient bucolic poetry and all that stuff, right? Pastoral poetry. But it's also like the image of the man holding the scythe is also an image of death, right? The mower. Right? That mows everyone down in the end. Or in the way Horace puts it, tempus edax rerum, right? Time, the devourer of all things, right? We were talking about death and time when we were reading the Mahabharata, right? I mean, that specter is always here too. And so the Mower poems kind of have that always hovering in the background. And they're all relating to one another in that green world.
But the Mower Against Gardens is a bit different from the other 3, where the mower has a name and also is pining over a named woman, Juliana. And that's not really in the Mower Against Gardens. We don't have his name as Damon, and we don't have any mention of her. And it feels like it's a fairly different vibe from the other 3. It's still in that green world, as you say.
Yeah.
And, it's still thinking about this idea of the mower and what does that mean? But it seems like it's not, like the other 3 are way similar to each other in a way that this isn't.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing to say. I find them all really, I almost think of them as like different, like that they're almost synoptic, like as though it's giving you all, 4 different views in a way on that world.
Sure, but then this is the book of John.
Yeah, I guess that's a good way to put it. But it's giving you a sense of like this enclosed space of the garden being luscious, being luxurious, being double, being strange. Like all these words show up, and like forbidden, like he refers to the uncertain and adulterate fruit, the language of like a seraglio or eunuchs and so on. Like there's all this weird sexualized language being associated with the garden. And that becomes more explicit and more kind of grounded with each one of the poems. So in Damon the Mower, again, we have this kind of green world where, he speaks, right? So the opening stanza is just like, okay, here's the mower Damon, like, and then he laments kind of this inability to get what he wants, right? So he talks about the heat of the summer, and the heat that's caused by his love for Juliana, right? And so he says this: "Tell me where I may pass the fires of the hot day or hot desires. To what cool cave shall I descend, or to what gelid fountain bend? Alas, I look for ease in vain, which when remedies themselves complain. No moisture but my tears do rest, nor cold but in her icy breast. Right? I mean, it's like, at those opening lines, again, they're doing something weird with the meter, tell me, instead of being iambic, right? It's reversed, right?
Well, that's a feature of iambic poetry that you can do.
Yeah.
And that's one of the interesting things is that we think of iambic rhythm as just da-da, 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 da-da. But because that gets boring fast, poets have introduced all sorts of things, including the inversion, which is what we have here. Tell me where I, which you can do at the beginning of a line. Or also ba-da-da-da can sometimes happen. And we see that in both Marvell and Donne sometimes.
Yeah.
So this is a typical thing that you're allowed to do, although it is, it's a thing. It's a thing that you're supposed to notice when you're reading it as a little bit of a change.
Yeah. And of the hot day, that too, right? Short, short, long, long, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's the one. Of the hot day is another type of way that you can start a line or a phrase within a line instead of just doing da-da, da-da.
Yeah. So anyway, so this is the second of these four. And then that short little one, the mower to the glowworms. It's, it's sort of tiny and self-contained and very quiet, right? Very, I don't know. It's a very different light on this kind of green world. And then finally the mower song, which is really weird, I think, because it's got this refrain that I'm curious what you think about it metrically. So I'm just going to read one stanza. This is the fourth stanza. But what you in compassion ought shall now by my revenge be wrought, and flowers and grass and I and all will in one common ruin fall. For Juliana comes, and she, what I do to the grass, does to my thoughts and me. So you have like these like normal lines, right? And then the last line, you got the last 3 feet are normal iambic feet, right? And then what I do to the grass, like what is that?
Yeah, you've got all these lines of 4, and then suddenly you've got a line of 6 at the end of it. And then those last 2 lines, when Juliana came and she, what I do to the grass, does to my thoughts and me, is a 6th line, which is sort of weird and long and interesting, and throws the whole thing off balance a bit.
Mm-hmm. And they're not iambic, right? What I do and to the grass, right? They're like a different kind of feet.
They are iambic, but they are heavily switched around. What I do to the grass does to my thoughts and me. That's an inversion there at the beginning of the pause, which you're allowed to do and still count as iambic, but it is definitely like, it is a thing. I'm trying to say that this is something that's totally allowed, but it's a little like drum fill kind of thing where you're spicing up the rhythm a bit.
Yeah. It's so weird.
Yeah.
And it gives you a sense of time, right? Because that refrain comes back and comes back again. And all the Mower poems are about time and how it's going to sort of inexorably eat you up one way or the other. So you might as well go to bed.
Except that's not what this is about, right? But all of these Mower poems, or these Mower poems involving Juliana, are all about, I like being out in nature. It's sensual. It's fantastic. It's my element. It's where I belong. And then I fell in love with this woman. And now all I'm thinking about is her. And I hate it. And so just like she's ruined my life by making me fall in love with her and not returning my love, I am ruining these plants. I'm going to think of what she did to me as I slice down this grass. It's really wild. And I kind of like, I find it a real turnoff to hear some of these things. Maybe it's because there's so much popular music these days about I love you. Why don't you love me back? This makes me angry, and I'm going to take it out on the world just like you took it out on me. And it removes so much agency from her. She has nothing in these poems. She does nothing. She only exists as the object that the mower has fallen in love with through seemingly no fault of her own and no encouragement. And she's just not returning it. It's not even clear that she's like said no. She's just not there. And he takes it so personal and imbues the world with his fury about this. And that I have to admit, I don't like it. I don't like that.
Well, yeah, to be clear, there's zero reciprocity in these poems, right? I mean, we can talk about whether there is in Donne or not, but in Mower, and I guess that's what I find really interesting. I mean, it's just about desire. Like, it's like other people are irrelevant. And that's apparent in the Mower poems to some extent. But then in the garden, it's even more evident. He's really explicit. He says, 2 paradises were in one to live in paradise alone. And so there's still desire and there's still sexuality and even like a kind of intercourse with nature itself, right? And I just find that really interesting. Like, what does it mean to think about all that separate from the world of engaging with it. Like, I mean, it's not that reciprocity isn't good. Reciprocity is really good, but what does it mean to think about? Like, what is that in itself? Is it a creative impulse? Is it a destructive impulse? Is it inwardly turned? Is it fundamentally mental? Is it mainly physical? Is it about flesh at all? Right? Or is it a kind of a state of being outside of time? Right. And I feel like the garden, I think, does the best job of kind of opening that up. And, but the Mower poems, I think, are part of that larger environment as well.
There's a great stanza towards the end of the garden. Such was the happy garden state, while man there walked without a mate. After a place so pure and sweet, what other help could yet be meet? A reference to Eve being a helpmeet in Genesis. But 'twas beyond a mortal's share to wander solitary there. 2 paradises 'twere in one, to live in paradise alone. Like, wow, this is so misanthropic. This is so against society and against people, and it's against human contact, right? So if it's about sex, it's about sort of this more better sex that you can find in nature, or sex or sexuality or sensuality, or, a wider sense of that. It's about how that is so much better. And it's so strange.
It is. And I wanted to say it's narcissistic, but it isn't, If we think about the myth of Narcissus, right? It's this idea of like admiring yourself, being self-absorbed in this kind of, endless mirror state. But it's also disembodied, right? In the myth of Narcissus, remember when we read Ovid, right? Narcissus wastes away, and leaves nothing but a flower behind as a kind of a reminder. This is very different from that because embodiment never goes away. And so a little earlier in the poem, there's this stanza that we included for the cold open, where it's like a wondrous life. Ripe apples drop about my head. The grapes crush themselves against his mouth. The peach reaches itself into his hands, is stumbling on melons. It's this weirdly sensuous world. But so it's not abstemious at all. That's the weird thing. Solitude is usually understood as kind of ascetic and like removing yourself from the.
That's not what this is at all.
This is the opposite of that. And yet it's also a kind of mental pleasure understood in terms of physical sensuousness, right? So he talks about the lovely green and the ways in which the mind withdraws into its happiness. And so that sort of balance between this utter physicality and sensuousness, and also complete abstraction. I mean, you think about the pleasure you get when you're doing something that's completely taking you into yourself, like whether you're writing or maybe creating in some way, whether it's art, whether it's music, you get like in this state where you're completely self-absorbed, right? You're just completely inside, and it's incredibly pleasurable.
Yeah.
Right? Like sex, right? It's pleasurable almost in the same way, but you're totally in your own mind. That's, I think, this world. When he talks about, the mind creates, transcending these far other worlds and other seas, annihilating all that's made to a green thought in a green shade. When you can't even hear the people talking to you.
And just to sort of come back to the Mower Against Gardens, the first poem that we looked at, the point of that poem is that not only is nature luxurious and sensual and so forth, but it kind of got weird and awful when people did things to it, right?
That's right. That's right.
People got really into tulips. This is right around the time of tulipomania over in Holland. And they made these hybrids and plants were made to do things that they don't normally do. And they were forbidden mixtures there to see. No plant now knew the stock from which it came. He grafts the wild upon the tame, et cetera, et cetera. And this is a problem. This is presented as it went too far. And that's why you get the eunuchs and the seraglio and so forth. That it's a perversion of sort of natural sex, but natural sex sort of still isn't the thing. It's still a sort of misanthropic idea here where you go out there and there are still sweet fields that do lie forgot, where willing nature does all to dispense a wild and fragrant innocence, and fauns and fairies do the meadows till, and presumably do more than tilling the meadows, so to speak. But, you've got this idea that there's still a space that you can escape to. Even nature, while it's being perverted by man's interference, still has these spaces that you can escape men to.
Yeah. But the paradox is that's the paradox of the garden, right? The garden is on the one hand paradise, right? Literally, right? It's that garden state. It's pure. It's like unimaginably beautiful and lush and perfect, right? But it's also, as he says in the Mower Against Garden, a dead and standing pool of air, right? A kind of artificial creation. And so there's two sides of the garden, this incredibly transcendent, space of almost, I don't know what to call it, like annihilation and rebirth, right? It's that, and it's also can be understood in this very negative way as like a place of art and all this language of perversion, grafting and, hybridity and all this stuff. So that double nature of the garden is something that's just, I think, so interesting.
And I found all of this quite strange because, as I mentioned, the Marvell poem that I'm most familiar with is To His Coy Mistress, which is completely different.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's got in common, I think, a preoccupation with time and how time is going to work. Like the garden poems are interested in time. The garden itself ends, as you notice, with this really bizarre stanza, which to this day I don't really understand why it's there. It seems like the poems ended, right, with the second to last stanza where it's like the one you quoted, 2 paradises twere and one to live in paradise alone. Then he has this like really weird stanza about clocks. It's like, how well the skillful gardener drew of flowers and herbs this dial knew, where from above the milder sun does through a fragrant zodiac run. And as it works, the industrious bee computes its time as well as we. How could such sweet and wholesome hours be reckoned, but with herbs and flowers? So he's describing a kind of a sundial, but it's made of plants planted in such a way that when they open and close, you can tell the time. And it's like, every time I read that, I'm like, what? I'm like, what? The idea that time could become visible in nature somehow, that, that's my sense of what's going on there. But To His Coy Mistress is also utterly preoccupied with time, but in a very different kind of way.
Yeah, this is much more that sort of conceit we were talking about earlier, where there's this sort of philosophical idea that is being employed in order to get someone to have sex with you.
Exactly. There's 3 sections. There's the if section, if we had world enough in time. And then there's the but part, right? But I always hear time's winged chariot hurrying near. And therefore, therefore, right? So it's like, if we had a lot of time, we could,
we could do all sorts of things.
We could do all sorts of things.
Have lots and lots of fun and put off the sex for much longer.
Exactly. But time is going by really, really fast. Now, therefore, let's have sex right now. And that last section basically uses the word now, instant, now. Like it's at once.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely.
But it's a very beautiful poem too. Like I completely see all the bad things about, and this can be true of Donne too. Like that poem On His Mistress Going to Bed. It's basically like, sexist and colonial and all these bad things, but it's like intensely attractive too. And I don't know what to do with that. So this poem, for example, I think is incredibly pleasing and just so great on the ear, To His Coy Mistress, and yet, kind of bad.
Do you find this poem funny?
No, I find it like kind of enthralling, especially because of the ways in which the meter of the lines hurries you up or slows you down. So, for example, in the first section, he goes, my vegetable love should grow vaster than empires and more slow. 100 years should go to praise thine eyes and on thy forehead gaze. Like the syllables just sort of slow you down. And then in the next part, at my back I always hear time's winged chariot hurrying near, and yonder all before us lie deserts of vast eternity. Like so they put you in a different, almost time signature. I like that.
Yeah, no, that's certainly true. That is well crafted. I don't know. I do find this poem. I don't know if I laugh out loud at it, but I do find it like it's meant to be funny. It's meant to be ridiculous. I mean, had we but whirled enough in time, this coyness lady were no crime. Like, there's a sense in which I don't know. Is she in on the joke? I think she is.
I think she's utterly irrelevant. I mean, I think all these she's are just.
I mean, it may not be a real she, but in the world of the poem.
Yeah, no, but they're like objects, right? They're backboards,
Oh,
right?
I guess, but then why are you going through all this rhetoric?
Yeah, maybe.
I mean, you're theoretically at least either trying to actually convince somebody or you're trying to make them laugh and charm them. And that's, I think, where this goes down one way or the other. I mean, she's not given any personality in this.
No.
She's given agency, sort of. Like, there's a thing that he wants her to do. Is she going to do it? Well, it depends on how good the poem is.
It's interesting though. You could be right, but I always get the sense, and it's funny, I never really thought about it consciously before, and I'm kind of looking at these tone poems right now. If I look at the Flea, Donne's The Flea, I'm like, yeah, this could legit be a poem trying to get somebody in the sack. And then I look at To His Coy Mistress, and I'm like, you're just being smart.
Yeah, no, fair enough. I think there is something, much more fleshy about the Flea, which we'll get to in a second. But yeah, I do think, I don't know. I find that line about my vegetable love should grow is kind of ridiculous. That sort of awkward line about till the conversion of the Jews, how that plays out. I mean, that happens at the end of days, right? Like, yeah, we could wait, and then we could wait till the end of days, and then I guess we could have sex. Like, that's a very weird, I mean, if you set aside the conception of Jews at that moment, Like, that's a really weird line.
Yeah, but if you look for the metaphysical part, if you look for the philosophy part, it's actually doing something super interesting. Okay, so the first section is about time in one way, which is looking back to the past. I would love you 10 years before the flood, and into the future. And you could refuse till the conversion of the Jews, right? So there's this distant past, this distant future, and the implicit now. And then the second part is like, wow, time is going by fast. It's just like, you imagine just like arrows all pointing in one direction. It's like, but linear time, right? And then the last part is now. Now, therefore, let us sport us while we may. And now, like amorous birds of prey, rather at once our time devour. Let us do this, now, right? Though we cannot make our son stand still, yet we will make him run. Right? So that's the clever part, right? That's the philosophical part.
That's one of the clever parts. Yeah. Yeah. But that's also a rhetorical part, right? Like, you've got this, okay, you're thinking in terms of your virginity and preserving it, which is a thing that is religiously oriented. It's a thing that is connected to you going to heaven, maybe. It's a thing that sort of stands out as an eternal verity in this world. And then he just narrows the field in more and more and more and says, that's all great, but it's irrelevant. And what you need to be thinking about is what's going on right now. And right now, in this very moment, we should be doing something. So it's a way of sort of acknowledging philosophy and playing with it, and then sort of putting it aside, or like, don't think in terms of that grand philosophy. Think about right now. Right now, you want to do something.
So I love those poems, and maybe, you can really see why I did not become a 17th century person, right? Because I really am attracted to them and enchanted by them, but I couldn't, how can I put it? I couldn't process them. I couldn't manage them the way that I am accustomed to managing things from, the Middle Ages, which is weird, right? Like, you wouldn't think there's so much affect at work.
No, I totally get it. I totally understand wanting your scholarly focus to be something that you find interesting and enjoy, but don't love.
Well, don't have feelings about. Like,
if it doesn't overwhelm you.
That's it. I think that's exactly it.
So on to John Donne, I think.
Should we look at the Flea first? Because we were kind of comparing it.
I think we should. I think we absolutely should look at the Flea first. I love this poem.
Yeah, read some of it, because it's, he doesn't have these very tight structures that we were observing in Marvell, but there's a incredible, interesting kind of musicality to it.
Sure. Mark but this flea, and mark in this how little that which thou deniest me is. It sucked me first, and now sucks thee, and in this flea our two bloods mingled be. Thou knowest that this cannot be said a sin, nor shame, nor loss of maidenhead. Yet this enjoys before it woo, and pampered swells with one blood made of two, and this, alas, is more than we would do. There's so much fascinating about this. So he's saying, okay, look at that flea that is currently biting you. It just bit me. And therefore, inside of it is not only its blood, but our bloods. And they're all mingling together in this weird Holy Trinity kind of situation. There's a bit of an echo of that in it. But more importantly, the bloods are mixing, which is, I don't know exactly the medical understanding of this, but it's one of the ideas that if we have sex, we're commingling our bloods.
Well, yeah, that in conception, that's one of the ways of understanding in terms of 17th century medicine what happens.
Yeah, exactly. Don't think too much about it, but that's the understanding. And then we end up with this lecture. One of the things that I find really interesting about the meter here is that, okay, so very often you get lines of 4 in iambic poetry, and that can often lead a very ballad sounding, very sing-songy da 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 ba 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 da. Fine. So that gets a bit much. You get 5, which is like your typical Shakespeare meter, and that's very powerful and oratorical. You can also have, like we saw in some of the Marvell poems, 5s followed by 4s, which is a nice sort of ba-da 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 ba-da. And it has this very musical, sing-songy, etc. Maybe not sing-songy, but it's got this very musical structure, and it's very propulsive. This is 4s followed by 5s, which is really weird. Mark but this flea, and mark in this how little that which thou deniest me is. And that means that you've got this line that's setting you up for one thing, and then it just gets sort of drawn out a bit more. I find this a lot more conversational and a bit strange, and it doesn't settle easily into any of the familiar English poetry rhythms. I think this is a fairly unusual pattern to have. It also has quite a lot of, let's say, really basic rhymes in the middle of it. It sucked me first, and now sucks thee, and in this flea our two bloods mingled be. This is infantilizing. It's intentionally infantilizing, right? He's turning to this woman and saying, I'm going to lecture you a little bit now. This is basic baby stuff. You should be able to figure this out. I think it's meant sort of ironically or winkingly. Like, I think he doesn't think she's an idiot. But he is pretending like, okay, we're in lecture time and I'm going to be the big professor and you're the student and we're going to explain a little bit about what's going on here and you're going to listen and like it. And I'm going to lay it out real simple for you. And then it ends with this extra line of 5 at the very last of it, just to throw everything off into more disarray. And of course, it's Donne. And Donne has the weirdest sense of iambs in any poetry that I've ever read. It's been a long time since I've studied this, but I seem to recall that there were people who even argued that he was just doing 10-syllable lines, that they aren't even all that iambic, because he would break the rules in ways that no one else breaks them. You get this line in the second verse, though use make you apt to kill me, which does not, like, I can't use any of the typical rules to make that work in a typical iambic line. But maybe that's his ear. And that's part of what I'm attracted to, is just trying to figure out, wait, how does that line work? What is your ear like that sounds like an iambic line to you? Or does it? And he's just at the liminal edge of this making sense and this not making sense. That's beside the point in terms of what's going on in the poem. What's going on in the poem is this really fantastic lecture about this flea who has mingled our bloods within it. And therefore it's fine. Therefore, there's no reason why we shouldn't have sex. Look, it already has happened in the flea.
Yeah.
What are you worried about?
Yeah. And you're touching on something really interesting, I think, there, when you're sort of taking apart what's going on with his meter, is that, this question of control and lack of control, like to what, how can I put it? How much overflow, how much exuberance, how much too muchness are you going to accommodate in the poetic line, right? And that seems to be a really interesting negotiation that takes place there, because there is some ways in which there's a tremendous amount of control evident in this poem. So the 3 parts, look at the flea, then the elaboration of the flea, as a kind of vehicle again for the metaphysical conceit. The flea can represent you and me, and it can represent our marriage bed. It can represent our marriage temple. It's the body of the flea is made up of walls of jet, right? Black walls, right? So it's like, it's funny and ridiculous, but it's again that sort of metaphor that keeps on giving, just keeps on giving. And then in the 3rd stanza, she's obviously killed the flea, right? And he's like, cruel and sudden hast thou since purpled thy nail in blood of innocence. Right.
Which, by the way, she gets some agency, right?
Yeah. No, you're right.
He's in the middle of this lecture and she's just thwap.
She's like, okay, it's dead now.
No, we're not doing this.
Right. And so it's playful and interactive in a certain kind of way. And so there's, it's not that there's not control. There is control, but there's also this accommodation of the unexpected, which is really interesting and very different from Marvell.
Yeah, it's interesting. I never found Donne's poetry lacking in control. It's just playing by a different set of rules. And it's hard to piece out exactly what those rules are. It's a bit hard to codify. But he does sound like he knows what he's doing. It doesn't sound like amateur hour at the poetry slam. It sounds confident and it sounds assured and it sounds sensical. It's just weird.
Yeah. So which of these Donne poems do you like the most? Like, we talked a little bit about the flea, but of the others, which are the ones that speak to you most, or did you like the most?
Well, the flea, I think, is my favorite. To His Mistress going to bed, really struck me, mostly because it got much more explicit than I was expecting. It also has some of the problematic stuff, including lines that I knew that I didn't realize were from this poem or didn't remember were from this poem. I'm sure I've read it before, but... Yeah,
I'm going to read a little bit of that because it's at once incredibly beautiful and at once incredibly bad. In the margin, I've written, and yet, and underneath that, colonialism. Okay, license my roving hands and let them go. Before, behind, between, above, below. Oh, my America, my newfound land, my kingdom safeliest when with one man manned, my mine of precious stones, my empery, how blessed am I in this discovering thee. To enter in these bonds is to be free, then where my hand is set, my seal shall be. It's like, at once, I'm filled with 2 emotions. At once, I'm like, whoa. On the other hand, I'm like, oh, God. I don't know what to do with that.
I mean, just to clarify, the mistress is coming to bed and is undressing and he's narrating. He's doing color commentary about the whole undressing and coming into bed. And then at this point, feeling her.
Yeah, the whole earlier part of the poem, I mean, that's a turn when you get the license my roving hands line, right? And so before that, it's like, off with that girdle, unpin that spangled breastplate, unlace yourself, off with that happy busk, off with that wiry coronet, now off with those shoes. You know, it's like, yeah, it's just like, almost like a striptease, right?
Yeah,
It's like, take this off,
exactly.
take that off, take this off, take that off. And then you get this passage that I just read.
And then that incredibly sensual line with the prepositions, with just the prepositions. My hands are going before, behind, between, above, below.
I know.
What a
Isn't
tour
that
de force
amazing?
of a line. Woo.
I know.
I don't know why that affects me so much, but it's so good to just have these 5 iambic prepositions just working perfectly like that.
It's amazing.
And then it gets really problematic with the colonial stuff.
I know. It's terrible. But like you said, that line in particular is just amazing. And then it goes on, like, sort of to describe, I want to say, like, the ecstatic, right? So the next section is full nakedness, all joys are due to thee, as souls embodied, bodies unclothed must be, to taste whole joys. And he goes on to use this metaphor, like pictures or like books, gay coverings made for laymen or all women thus arrayed, themselves are mystic books. So there's this strange thing going on in this section, this third section, where, like, you know, this is the same the way that souls have to be stripped out of the bodies, right, to achieve kind of the bliss of heaven. So too, bodies have to be unclothed. And he says, to taste whole joys. What is that, whole joys?
Well, I think we'll hear more about them when we get to Dante's Paradiso.
Yeah.
In terms of, you know, the whole joys, the fullness of the joy that you're expected to experience once you have left your body and gone to heaven and so forth and are in that form of paradise. And then the closest you can get to that on earth, I guess, is when you are naked and presumably when you are either having sex or just in an ecstatic embrace with, you know, a loved one.
Yeah. Where, again, this idea of where time stops, right? And, you know, that metaphor of, like, you know, the bodies and the clothing and so on, they're like beautiful book covers. And so women, then he says, are mystic books. And so it's this, again, it's one of those strange metaphysical conceits, right? Where, like, in what way is a person like a book, especially a mystic book, that is a book that requires a kind of allegorical or exegetical interpretation for its understanding, right? So it's like, it's a strange moment.
In a literal sense, you know, he's talking about removing your gems and your jewelry and what the purpose of the jewelry is for. And so I guess mystic books, you know, books that are bound and covered in jewels.
Yeah, exactly.
But then you still have to open them up to read them to get at the good bits.
That's it. And he's going on to say that, you know, there's also mystic books, which only we, whom their imputed grace will dignify, must see revealed. Then, since that I may know, as liberally as to a midwife show thyself, cast all, this white linen hence, there is no penance due to innocence. Right? So, like, I'm capable of appreciating what you are, so take off your clothes. So, I mean, again, it's the same kind of dynamic we've seen in, like, To His Coy Mistress and stuff like that. But in a very, it is a different mode, a different negotiated kind of mode.
And then there's that final couplet, which is weird. To teach thee, I am naked first. Why then what needst thou have more covering than a man? And it's like, so I'm already naked, by the way. I didn't mention this at the beginning of the poem, but I've been naked this whole time in an educative sense. Because again, that metaphor keeps coming up, which is probably unfortunate, but there you go. And then, you know, why would you need to cover yourself more than I'm covered? Yeah. Which there may be answers logical. For that, but
I know
he's going to just wave that by. It's a really weird ending to that poem, I think.
Yeah, I know. I mean, you can see why people either like really like metaphysical poetry or really like, what is this? Because it's so strange.
I feel like we should talk about one of the more explicitly religious but still weirdly sexual poems that we've included in the packet.
Yeah.
Is there one that you prefer to talk about?
Well, I think maybe the most straightforward one to talk about is one of the holy sonnets, Batter My Heart, Three-Person God. And the reason I think this is a neat one to turn, I mean, it's a neat poem, but also it kind of gives you a sense of how the heteronormative order that we've just seen, you know, vigorously expressed is still apparent in the religious writing, but in a slightly different way. So, should I read a little bit of it?
Sure.
Actually, it's short, so I'll read it. Batter my heart, three-person God, for you as yet but knock, breathe, shine, and seek to mend, that I may rise and stand, o'erthrow me and bend your force to break, blow, burn, and make me new. I, like an usurped town to another, do labor to admit you, but owe to no end. Reason, your viceroy in me should defend, but is captive and proves weak or untrue. Yet dearly I love you, and would be loved fain, but am betrothed unto your enemy. Divorce me, untie, or break that knot again. Take me to you, imprison me, for I, except you enthrall me, shall never be free, nor ever chaste, except you ravish me. It's something.
That is something. Yeah.
I mean, it's God, please rape me. And it's like, okay.
Or at least, I want to, at least be a dom. At least be an aggressive dom.
Well, yeah. And it's paradoxical, right? Like, if you ravish me, I'll be chaste. If you enthrall me, like enslave me, I'll be free, and so on, right? So it's part of that sort of paradoxical nature of the encounter with the divine, right? So there's kind of a category for thinking about this, but it is very explicit, right? And again, we were talking before about all those prepositions above, below, beneath, between that language. Here you have something kind of comparable going with break, blow, burn, make me new.
Yeah, we have several of these quick lists of verbs that take us through a whole journey. Knock, breathe, shine, and seek to mend. Break, blow, burn, and make me new. You've got this arc of break me down and then build me up again. But it is remarkable how much this is trucking in the language of BDSM.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
and that same form of sexuality where you are submitting, and that is a liberatory gesture for you. I mean, it doesn't work for everyone, but but it does for some. And that is the sexualized relationship that you're imagining as a way of thinking about your relationship with God is obviously is fascinating, especially coming from a priest.
Yeah. I mean, I guess it's because in all these cases, what's being talked about is these extremes of experience, whether it's passion, desire, yearning, a kind of hunger, right? All of these extreme states of being in relation to another. Right? So whether it's the soul and God, or whether it's the lover and beloved, right? There's this kind of straining at that relationship where it becomes impossible to express in regular language. And again, so interesting to compare that to Marvell, who is not interested in other people.
Yes.
Is interested in the desire and the passion and everything that comes with that, right? Those peaches and apples pushing themselves into your hands, but not other people. And here it's just the converse. Right? It is exactly about the encounter.
So that is our cluster on sex.
That was a really interesting cluster. And I feel like with the lyric poetry, that was an interesting experiment. I wonder if we'll do something like that again in the future. I
imagine so, especially if we end up looking at any other lyric poets, although maybe we'll just stick to one if we do someone like Emily Dickinson. But who knows? What are we going to do next? Well, now we are at the end of the year.
At our turning point.
Yeah. And last year, we did an episode on somebody who we had lost last year. We did our episode on Toni Morrison's Beloved. And we followed it up by an episode for the new year in which we looked at literature that is, let's say, underread and underappreciated. And we're still debating and thinking about what book we're going to look at for our future looking episode. But for our next episode, we're going to be looking at The Boys in the Band by Mart Crowley, who passed away this year. And it is a work that is going to be interesting to look at, and also interesting because they made it into a movie in 1970, around when the play was first released. And it's sort of a snapshot of what gay life was like then for a particular set of people, let's say. And it's really weird that they've remade it this year, the year that he passed. I haven't seen the new version yet. I'm super curious why they're bringing it back. And I haven't seen this movie or read the play in ages. And I'm curious to encounter it again and to think about how it's changed as times have changed and as I've gotten older and all of that.
No, that will be really neat to think through together, because I've never read the play before, but I had seen the 1970 film, but again, a really long time ago. Like, I think I was still in my teens when I saw it.
So that is what we're doing next time. But until then, if you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us, as always, at spouter@megaphonic.fm, or we're on Twitter at The Spouter, and we'd love to hear from you. Show notes with links for anything we've mentioned in this episode are at megaphonic.fm/spouter/39, and the Spouter-Inn is one of the fancy little podcasts over at Megaphonic FM. So, until next time.
Until next time, see you again at the Spouter-Inn.